So welcome, I'm glad you could make it. Forums is a Christian Union event where a group of people who, what was the line that we'd come up with this year? It was the people who want to make Jesus known. So I'm glad you could all make it. So forums are all about looking at topics. We're in a series about challenging some worldly ideologies and stuff like that. So what's kind of the difference between what a lot of the world thinks and what Christianity thinks. And later on we're going to look at how kind of the Christian worldview affects our work. So that's from weeks 5 and onwards, and we're going to be here pretty much every time. So keep coming along, it's going to be fantastic. All different fields.
We do shift to Thursday lunchtime.
Yeah, we do shift to Thursday. So in week 5 we shift to Thursday. But this week we're talking about Helen Bell's going to speak, who is one of the staff workers here at CU, and she's going to be speaking about the truth about relativism. So I look forward to it. So let's welcome Helen.
Now, I must admit, I'm a little bit nervous about speaking on this topic because I'm not a philosopher. And I feel like as soon as you talk about the truth about relativism, you're talking about philosophy. And to be honest, I often find philosophers quite hard to read. It takes me a long time to work out what they're saying, and then I think, is that all you're saying? It's just a style of writing that I don't feel comfortable with. But the irony of this is about relativism is about people deciding for themselves what truth is. So at that point, I've got as much right to have an opinion on this as any philosopher who's studied it. So, listen, people, you don't have to agree. The truth about relativism is that it's a topic that invites a discussion about philosophy, but it invites much more than that, because it's not just a topic for philosophers. I think it's a topic for everyday people like me, because relativism, whether we call it that or not, is part of the air we breathe. There's no such thing as truth. This is true for you, but it may not be true for me. Truth is relative. Different cultures have different truths. Be true to yourself, unconstrained by community or physicality or relationships. Follow your feelings. Don't push your morality on me. Or religions, different paths to the one God. It's part of the air we breathe, this kind of thinking. So it can't just be a topic for philosophers, because we hear it, we think it, we imbibe it. I think we're experiencing a loss of confidence that anything can be known for sure. It's all just a matter of opinion and perspective and personal agenda. And I know I tend to be sceptical of any truth claims. And our politicians don't help us at the moment. There's just this scepticism about an ability to get to truth. So today I'm here to offer some thoughts on the truth about relativism. I offer them as a non-expert. I've done some reading, I've done some thinking, I've got some ideas. That's the heart with which I offer this, to help us reflect on this. I want to start with a quick definition of relativism and look at its origins. Explore what makes it attractive, because I actually think it is attractive. But then be honest, tell the truth about what I think its failure is to deliver on what it promises, and offer a truth about Jesus as a better way forward. That's kind of the logic of this. So to start with the definition, relativism is the view that truth is relative to a particular context. Truth is not absolute. It varies from people to people, person to person, time to time, culture to culture. There are no absolutes. Truth is determined or created rather than discovered. At the heart of relativism is the idea that your perspective determines your view or opinion of truth. Perspective shapes how you interpret something, whether you define something as right or wrong, true or untrue, good or bad. Descriptive relativism is the observation that humans actually have different opinions on things. It just describes things, right? That is the fact. People, cultures have different opinions. Normative relativism goes beyond that. It goes beyond the observation that people have different opinions and argues that context determines not just people's perception of right or wrong, but what is right or wrong. So it's going beyond, I just notice that people think differently, to there is no truth. Truth can be whatever you make it to be. There's no absolute right or true, there are just beliefs about what is right or true. And that these beliefs are relative to the culture in which they're held. It's the difference between saying murder is wrong and I think murder is wrong and my culture teaches that murder is wrong. They're not all saying exactly the same thing, even though the words that come out of our mouth, that murder is wrong, might be the same because we assume all sorts of these other subtleties. Now, relativism has a long history. I didn't know that until I did my reading for this. It starts back with the Greek philosophers. Who knew it came? Brandon knew. Who knew? Brandon knew. See, this is why I'm nervous, because he's done more thinking than I have. Feel free to push back, brother. What is it? Yeah. The quote I've got here is, "Man is the measure of all things, of the things which are, that they are, and of the things that are not, that they are not." He's basically saying truth is not determined by things outside a person, but by a person's perspective. Now, that was refuted by Plato. He got nailed at the time. Plato basically said relativism is self-refuting. You can't say that truth is relative and then expect people to be persuaded by you saying that. If truth is relative, you can't then make an absolute statement that truth is relative. So, you know, that's got a long history, that kind of self-refuting argument. I think it's an ongoing critique for the topic. I don't think it's a dated critique. I think it's an ongoing critique. Now, relativism, I think, has gained currency and acceptance now for all sorts of reasons. When you read about this, different authors speak of different influences to try and explain how we got to where we are. According to John Dixon, this is kind of, he wrote an article for the Centre of Public Christianity, so it's his kind of summary I'm running off. Philosophy helped us get to where we are. So you kind of go back to Kant in the mid... Kant or Kant? How am I meant to pronounce it?
American Kant, Australian Kant.
Okay.
The name.
You go back to him, and it's saying something like, the true nature of reality is beyond our human senses. We can only trust our senses. So stuff like God, they're inaccessible. You can't get beyond what you can... You can't make statements of truth about what you can't see or feel. Is that a very broad summary? Yeah. Now, Kant's followers moved from this to start to argue that the only real things, so it's not just you can't get to it, but the only real things that you can have are things you can see and touch and smell. Everything else is subjective and speculative. Now, that has to include things like spirituality and ethics. You can't see or touch them. So philosophy kind of helped us get here. Anthropology helped us get here. You know, as the new world was discovered, people suddenly came across... Oh, yeah, you're the anthropologist, aren't you? Right? Suddenly, these people are discovering all of these cultures and places and people that think very differently to them. Observationally, different societies have different practices, beliefs, ethics. They do have different, sometimes radically different, definitions of right and wrong. How do you explain that? The American Anthropological Association in 1947, here's what they wrote: moral values are relative to individual cultures and ought not to be thought to apply universally. Basically, they've moved from descriptive relativism, cultures are different, to normative relativism, there is no truth. So move from the observation to an interpretation of it. Psychology also helped us get to where we are today. Freud appears in the late 1800s, and he argues that many of our beliefs and actions are determined by patterns of thought which lie beneath the surface of our everyday consciousness. In particular, religious sentiment is some longing for the father figure that we never had. So he's moved from religion is not just a social construct relative to a communal or cultural framework, it's now a psychological construct. It's only true within our own mind. So it's not just true within our community, it's become very personal at this point. Truth is how I perceive it, not even how we perceive it. Now, despite where the philosophers go with this, what they talk about, I suspect that most of us don't actually believe that every truth is relative. We certainly don't live like it is. If a bus is coming down the road towards me and you shout, "Get out of the way," I won't sit there and think, is that bus really there? If I believe the bus is not there, I move. So despite the philosophers go into all sorts of arguments about what is the nature of reality and how do you... most of us don't go there. We actually don't believe all truth is relative. But there are a number of areas where life and truth are commonly viewed relativistically. Culture, morals, religion, I think, are probably the key areas, and that's what I'm going to focus on, not the esoteric out there stuff. Cultural relativism is the view that no one culture is better or worse than another. They're just different. Further, the values that are true in one culture are not necessarily true in another culture. We're hesitant to judge what people in other cultures do from our own standpoints. We're wary of cultural imperialism because we've seen the damage it can do. We're wary of saying my way is the right way, not just for me and us, but for you. Last week, I was out talking with a woman about gender norms in different cultures. Education, marriage age, different opinions about what people think about women and their roles in community, and how challenging that is for her as someone who's doing development studies, who wants to go overseas and do good, and what does good look like when cultures have radically different understandings of gender. Cultural relativism. Moral relativism, I think, is probably the articulated foundation for much of the morality of our culture. Definitions of right and wrong vary not just across societies, but even between individuals within a community, and I think even over one individual's life, as someone changes and develops different forms of what is truth and right. Community, I've lost my train, even across individuals. The community reflection of community standards will be found in the law and social norms. Different communities will have different truths about right and wrong. As I started working with international students, one of the things that fascinated me was the different ways how you said no to someone or weren't allowed to say no to someone. So me as an older asking someone to come and visit, would you want to read the Bible and pray with me? Yes, was the answer I got, when they had no intention of coming. But to say no to me was considered rude. I felt like it was lying because they had no intention. That was my perception of it, but for them it was respect and honour. Let's not shame and embarrass the poor woman by having to say no to her face. There's kind of community standards of what's right and wrong. When is it okay to lie? And even the use of lie is a pejorative statement there. Right? They're saving my honour. Moral relativism also notes that not just different communities but different people have different truths about right and wrong. Is gambling a pernicious destroyer of community, or is it harmless entertainment? People have markedly different. My view on that has changed over the years. Based on personality, character, experience, moral relativism. The final one we'll do a little bit of thinking about is religious relativism. This starts with the observation that different people have different religious views. And because of that, the logic goes, there's no way of determining which, if any, are right, so we assume that they're all equally valid. Not just in the sense that people should have freedom to practice whatever religion they believe in, but equally valid in the sense that they are all a truthful reflection of the spiritual realm and spiritual life. Or perhaps they're not just equally valid, perhaps they're all actually the same. They're different ways to the one God or the one truth. So the suggestion that religious truth is plural in form, not singular. The classic picture of this is your elephant diagram. All right, you've got blind people clustered around an elephant, and one can touch the tail and says, "Ooh, this is rope." One hugs the leg. "Ooh, this is a tree." One hugs the ear, and I don't know, what would an ear be? A fan. But they're all actually describing the same thing. They're describing an elephant or a part of an elephant. They've just got different perspectives on it. And I think underlying that is meant to be a sense of humility, right? You arrogant religious people to think you can describe the whole. People need to learn humility and recognise that none of them has the whole truth. They just have parts of the truth, which is kind of ironic because the point of the story is exactly the opposite, right? There is one person who can see the elephant, who can then say to everyone else, you can't see the truth. So I'm not entirely sure that it does breed humility, because there is the claim that someone has the truth. We'll come back to that later. Does diversity necessarily imply relativity? Does observing the fact that there is diversity of opinion necessarily imply a diversity of truth? I think I want to say opinions can be wrong, can't they? You can be sincerely wrong. I'm not even saying you're lying. You can. It's possible. Diversity of opinion and diversity of truth are not the same thing. For a long time, people thought the world was flat. Now, they believed that. They had good reasons for believing that, well, I'd argue. That doesn't necessarily mean they're right. The way that looks like, or I've seen it look like for me, being told that Christians and Muslims are both right about Jesus, even though I would argue they say contradictory things about Jesus. I think it's possible for someone to say, I believe Jesus is Lord, and for another person to say, I believe Allah is Lord, and for them both to be telling the truth, because that's about sincerity of belief. I believe this. But it's quite a different thing to say that Jesus is Lord and Allah is Lord. Both can't be true, in that both can't describe the one man, because they say he is God, he's not God. They're actually saying contradictory things. And if Jesus is external to me and to us, if he exists or existed apart from me, I don't make him who he is. My belief about him doesn't make him who he is. He is. And I can know him truthfully or not, and we both could be wrong. Okay, the Muslims and the Christians could be wrong, but they can't both be true at the same time. Religious relativism. Now, while I'm not persuaded about relativism, as that will become clear, has become clear, I actually think there's a lot of attractiveness to it. I think relativism is attractive. I think one of the attractive features of relativism is that it offers us a way of being inclusive. Okay, it's nice. We live in communities filled with diversity. We live in a world filled with diversity, and we need to work out how to live next door to people who think differently, how to create a community where people don't just survive without killing each other, but actually thrive, like each other, enjoy each other, respect each other. We need a way of recognising a common humanity even in the midst of different opinions and practices. And I think relativism is an attempt to recognise this reality. We live in a multicultural, multi-religious world. And it's a way of doing that without the need for uncomfortable value judgments about whether people are right or wrong. That's just icky, isn't it? It's hard. Without the necessity of people changing who they are or what they believe, how they live, to belong to us. Relativism allows us to get around that. And if we look back on the history of European expansion, we see and feel the wrongness of one culture imposing itself on another culture. Imperialism is not attractive. And we're nervous, frankly, about any form of extremism, whether on the political right or the political left, whether grounded in an explicitly religious worldview or in an atheistic worldview. And we're feeling the ugliness of that, I think, particularly at the moment, given what happened in New Zealand. It's scary. We're nervous. Now, it is certainly true, I think, that normative truth claims can be oppressive and divisive. I don't think they have to be. Depends on the nature of the truth claim. But they can be. And I wonder whether relativism might be one of those ones that is oppressive and divisive. There's the radical thing. See, I wonder whether inclusiveness is best achieved through relativism. I've got a question about whether it's really inclusive. Is inclusiveness best achieved through relativism? Is it really tolerant? Does it really respect difference? And I wonder whether the truth about relativism is that it promises more than it delivers when it comes to inclusiveness. Because it's a strange form of inclusiveness that requires everyone to have a relativistic worldview. That's just a strange form of inclusiveness, that you must all agree that truth is relative, and then treats them with some form of nervous suspicion if they don't believe that. Wonders whether you're being boxed as an oppressive presence. And I actually think it's possible to respectfully disagree, actually. I think it is possible to have respectful disagreement, not oppressive disagreement. To listen to what someone thinks, why they think it, and to seek to understand it. To disagree with it without telling them you're an idiot, right? You can disagree respectfully, in a way where you actually try to unpack what they think and why they think it, and where they diverge from you, and what their logic is, and where it comes from. And that's quite respectful to engage with someone at that level, I would argue. Arguably, that's what real tolerance is. Not saying that we all believe the same thing, but respecting people's right to hold a view even when I disagree with it. I will tolerate us being different, not pretend that there is no difference. I think you include people by taking what they say seriously enough to engage with it. Relativism offers no means of verifying or falsifying any belief. Apart from whether a person or culture holds it, that's what you've got. And I don't want to... It's almost like the difficulty of working out what is true under relativism says we just don't try to decide. We just say it's all true. I want to say some things are so important. Truth might be difficult to get to, but it's worth the effort of attempting to get there. I think there's a risk with relativism as we talk about inclusiveness of, how to put this, indifference. I don't need to know what you think. I just need to respect your right to think it, so we don't need to understand each other. I worry sometimes that the way we think about relativism is we don't engage. We sit next to each other but we don't talk because we don't need to. We just assume your belief is your belief and my belief is my belief and we're free to hold it. It's a strange kind of inclusiveness that can lead to indifference. As Andy pointed out 2 weeks ago, Jesus didn't run around saying tolerate your neighbour. He said love your neighbour. I think it's a strange kind of inclusiveness that insists that if I happen to believe something is true, I'm wrong. Christians believe Jesus is God, Muslims believe he's a prophet but not God. Both of us believe we're right, but relativism tells us that we're both wrong to believe we're right. That's an odd kind of inclusiveness to do that. Now, I'm talking about religion, but it happens across the board. Don't misunderstand me. The truth about relativism, I think, is that it promises more than it delivers. It fails to deliver genuine inclusiveness and respect. What it delivers, I wonder, is a pale imitation of the real thing. I think another attractive feature of relativism is that it offers us a way of valuing and affirming personal freedom. It offers no moral truth to limit our freedom, no truth independent of our minds and feelings, so we have the freedom to form our identity as we see fit and not have some external structure or understanding imposed on us. Freedom is the right of the individual to choose their own values, only limited by the good of not imposing on the freedoms of others. Freedom to create and recreate yourself. And freedom is good. Freedom is a good thing. It's an honest thing. I mean, I love that minorities are free to be equal participants in our community. I love that women can be educated. That's why I'm standing here. The Me Too movement, I would like women to be free to walk the streets or to work. Freedom is a good thing. But I guess I wonder whether freedom is best achieved through relativism. What type of freedom does it deliver, and is this real freedom? Is it the type of freedom we want? See, the type of freedom offered by relativism, I think, is largely freedom from constraints. I can do and be what I want, constrained by no truth, no person, no social structure. And I wonder whether relativism has more to say about what we are free from and less to say about what we are free for. What is the life of freedom that relativism offers? Now, in this context, we always talk about you're free to do what you want so long as you don't harm others, right? Even relativism doesn't usually offer unqualified freedom. We recognise that we live in community and the choices we make affect others. And so freedom should be limited by the impact my choices have on others, which I think reflects the truth, the reality that we're not genuinely independent. We're interdependent. We need others and they need us. That's true of our past. I was raised in a family and a community, for good or bad. It's true of my future. I think our freedoms tend to be bound up with freedom of being known and loved, of being able to be ourselves, be seen to be ourselves, be accepted for who we are. That's freedom. Liberates you from fears and self-doubts, liberates you from the need to keep proving yourself. That's freedom, freedom in relationship. And any relationship, I think, to work... Ooh, I've just shrunk my screen, hang on. Any relationship requires the curtailing of freedom. Our freedom must be limited by the impact our choices have on others so that we do no harm. I think that's the general phrase, isn't it? Do no harm. But for this to work, I need a picture of what the good and thriving life is so that I can work out what constitutes no harm. What harms others has to be rooted in some generally acknowledged view of human nature and purpose and flourishing. What makes for the good life? What is well-being and how do we measure it? And one of the challenges of relativism is that it gives us no way of visualising this, agreeing on this. It may even say that there's no way of coming up with a common view on this. So I end up deciding what constitutes not harming you, and you'll just have to live with that. And you get to decide what constitutes not harming me, and I'll just have to live with that. Or if you're not deciding it and I'm not deciding it, our government will, or the majority will, or the strong will. So I think it's a strange kind of freedom that focuses on what we're freed from, but has less to say about what we're freed for, which is really what we're after. It's a strange kind of freedom that fails to wrestle at a deep level with the truth, the reality that we're interdependent, not independent. Fails to wrestle with the very real costs of our freedom on others. So I think the truth about relativism is that it promises more than it delivers. It delivers a type of freedom, but doesn't quite get us where we want to be. I think another attractive feature of relativism, I keep losing I lose a syllable in there somewhere, but you know what I mean. Another attractive feature is that it has the appearance of humility. I think it's based on the claim that we can't know the whole truth, we don't know the whole truth, and it's wrong to behave as though we do. So it's almost got its intellectual and epistemic humility built into its structure. But is it really humble? Is humility best achieved through relativism? See, it's a strange kind of humility, that whole elephant thing, right? It's a strange kind of humility that claims to see the whole picture while many of us only see parts. And we need to be told what the big picture is. The relativist sees the elephant, tells us that we're only seeing part, and if only we could see like they see, we'd be set free. And I'm not even sure that uncertainty necessarily is a reflection of humility. It's possible to be uncertain because you don't want to be convinced. And so there's benchmark after benchmark after benchmark that you set that just keeps rising. Setting unrealistic or unreasonable burdens of proof, setting up something to fail, making people jump through your hoops. Or even the refusal to acknowledge the wisdom or experience of others as an accurate determination of truth. My experience and my feelings are the measure of truth, the arbiter of truth. So I'm not even sure that uncertainty is necessarily a mark of humility. It can be. I'm not sure that it necessarily is. I think which raises the question of what type of truth can lead to humility. Is it possible to know truth and be humble, to believe you know truth, to claim you know truth and have humility? I think about the Christian truth claims that lead to do unto others as you would have them do to you and love your enemy as a truth claim. The idea that if you know God, it's not because of you, but because he has revealed himself to you. Not because of you and your specialness or your intellect, but because of his generosity and mercy. Because I think if I am certain of the truth through my own speculations, that could look a lot like arrogance and presumption. But the Christian understanding of truth, I wonder whether it comes at it with a posture of humility. It's revealed to limited individuals, and it's about humbling ourselves before others. Now, I'm just trying to suggest that relativism may not be as humble as it purports to be, I think. And I'm not trying to say that any and every truth claim is necessarily arrogant. So I think relativism just maybe promises a bit more than it delivers. I think there are a number of promises that relativism makes that it fails to deliver on, and ultimately I think the key limitation of relativism is that I think it's unlivable. And a belief that we can't live by is problematic. See, I think the truth about relativism is that we have no intention of putting it into practice consistently. We can't and we don't want to. For all sorts of reasons. A couple of them, I think it denies our moral intuitions. One of the limitations of relativism is that most of us believe there is a right and a wrong. We live as though there is. We expect it of others. That's why we get angry at injustice. We're not usually willing to admit that this is all purely subjective. Are we really comfortable saying that our moral intuitions are groundless? That's a big call. One of the limitations of relativism is that we are not able to say something is right or wrong. And there is a difference between saying apartheid is wrong and I feel apartheid is wrong. Not something is wrong. Our inability under relativism to say it's wrong, the most we can say is I don't like it and I would prefer it to be different and it would be good if it was different. That lacks punch and it's not actually what we feel. We have moral convictions and feelings with no way of implementing them. We believe in justice and injustice, but we can't call it that. We can't call evil evil. We can't criticise the moral behaviours of others. All I can say is I don't like what you're doing. We can feel something to be wrong, but lack the ability to say it with any integrity. And I do actually wonder whether relativism leads us to a lack of integrity. I can intellectually say this is fine, but my gut says no, it's not. And I follow my intellect and deny my conscience. Or I follow my conscience and deny the intellect. There's just a conflict there. When we look at the way morality is lived, it's not just a series of philosophical arguments. I think our inability to live consistently with the worldview and standards we profess is a problem for relativism. Another of its limitations, it undermines the quest for social justice. That assumes social absolutes that transcend time and culture that we should be working towards. It allows some differences in application according to time and culture, but it assumes there's some form of absolute out there. If I believe there are no moral truths to move towards, confirm, to embrace, if all you've got is a personal opinion generated by some form of feeling or intuition, what is the basis for persuading a person or a community to change? It's my view of what would be good for you. In the 1940s, when that American Anthropological Association, when it talked about moral values being relative to individual cultures, at about the same time the UN was developing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, motivated at least partially by the World War II atrocities in Germany. I'm glad they didn't listen to the Anthropological Association, because it would be very hard to defend universal standard. And it's interesting, they actually don't really defend it, they assert it. I'm glad that the UN didn't listen. They didn't ground their understanding of human rights and human dignity in anything really, they just asserted that it was. And I think it's hard, because if there is no truth, if nothing has transcendent value, it's hard to even say human beings have transcendent value. How does a relativist come up with a definition of humanity and human flourishing that can survive? Not just survive, but that can excite people, animate people, motivate us to protect people, transform people. That's what we want. And I think there's a real value in articulating the vision that directs one's life, to put it into words, because then I understand it and you understand it, you can argue with me about it. Relativism is problematic in our lived experience. And I wonder, this one's getting more and more speculative, right? So this one's moving further. I wonder whether relativism effectively leaves us with an underlying ethic that rests on either pleasure or power, both of which are problematic in some ways, neither of which are attractive when all's said and done. Ethical theories that can't appeal to objective moral facts. This is a quote from Bertrand Russell. Ethical theories cannot appeal to objective moral facts, but only to subjective emotions and feelings. Ethics is reducible to politics in the last analysis. I think he's saying if morality is fundamentally about what I think is good, what I feel is good, and not what is good, I think he's saying that essentially we're saying what is good is what I want, what I feel, what I like. Good ends up being what makes me or us happy, what works for me or us. And frankly, that rings warning bells for me. Starting to equate what is good with what I want or feel, when I know, most of us know if we're honest with ourselves, that many of the things we feel and want aren't good. Selfish, self-centred. I don't even match up to the picture of who I want to be, let alone worry about whether anyone else is matching up. Relativism is of limited help in that environment. That deep sense of I'm not right, we're not right. When your perception of what is right is what's driving your ethic. I don't think I can trust myself on this. Certainly I don't trust you on this, because you're like me, that's the problem. And according to Nietzsche, if truth is not the way of determining the values we have in common, power wins. If truth is about because I say it is, if that's what it boils down to, whoever has the power to implement that, what I say, wins. If truth doesn't define right, might makes right. Because I feel so and I said so, and if I can, I will make so. Any number of things could be said about relativism, but I'll leave it at that. Just some ideas as we think about its limits. I'm going to finish up, though, with a brief summary of how the Christian worldview deals with some of these things. Because it's not enough to criticise a worldview. That's actually easy pickings, right? Not hard to find faults. The harder thing is to give a way forward, a different way forward, to out-narrative the narrative, if you like. I've got something better. And I believe the Christian narrative does that. See, the Christian worldview, the interesting thing is, right, gospel proclamation has always happened in a pluralist world. This is not new. When you go back to ancient Israel, when you go back to the Roman Empire, there were always different people, different faiths. The Bible is a book written to many different people over many different times. The Israelites were enslaved or they were in power. It's written to individuals and nations. It's multicultural. It's multi-religious. It's a product. It is written to people who live in a multicultural society. This is not new. It's not just modern. And the Christian narrative is that we live in a world created by God, the God who exists. And the existence of God creates the possibility of truth. God is the ultimate and final standard for all truth claims. The God who created us, who treats us with dignity and holds us the dignity enough to hold us accountable for how we live. That's dignified. What you do matters, and I will notice it, and I will evaluate. I won't just pretend it didn't happen. And because he exists and he is God, frankly, what God thinks of us is more important than what we think of him. All religions are not the same. I don't define God. If anything, he defines me. He determines the nature of the world, what is right and wrong, not just by individual feeling or even democracy. It's not about personal conviction that varies. It's about the conviction of a God who is good and who is loving. A God who speaks into our world because we are so limited. Our perspective is so limited. A voice from outside, not just within. Not a voice from another person who is just as limited as you. Moral conscience, the Bible would argue, hints at this, that moral intuition that there is a right and a wrong, that we should live this way and not that way. I shouldn't, so should you, which is why we get angry at injustice and feel guilt and shame. A moral intuition that also reflects our failure to be who we should be, seeks justice, but values mercy at the same time, because we need it. And I think we see that most clearly in the coming of Christ, this picture of a man who lived as we all should. It's worth reading the Gospels. He lived the life we should live, love God and neighbour, broadly defined as enemy. So a God of integrity, he doesn't just tell us how to live, he lives it, he does it. A God of integrity, a God who, the Son humbled himself, became human, got up close, not at a distance, revealing to us who he is and who we should be and can be. A truth and morality that can be investigated. The Bible always encourages us to look for evidence as we look at Jesus, to ask questions about historicity, to ask questions about whether it is consistent with history, whether it's consistent with the world we live in, whether it's consistent with ourselves and what we hope for. So I think the truth about relativism is that it doesn't actually work. But I think there's a good alternative in the Christian story. That's all I got. So just some thoughts.